A little girl was secretly taking food from a store until one day she was caught by the owner, and the owner decided to follow the child to find out the truth. What she saw changed her outlook on life. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what you would do if you were the seller. The bell above the door chimed as another customer entered the small grocery store. Jessica Thompson barely glanced up from the register where she was counting the bills from her morning sales, for it was a slow afternoon, the kind she had grown accustomed to over the years. The neighborhood had changed since she first opened her store 15 years ago. The people were different now, more hurried, more desperate, and the crime rate had risen. Petty theft was something she dealt with almost daily. She sighed, closing the register and adjusting her apron, having long accepted that running a store in this part of town meant keeping a sharp eye on the shelves, especially near the front where the more expensive items were kept. She had seen all sorts of people come through, some honest, some not. Lately, she had been noticing a small, thin figure lingering outside near the dumpsters behind her store. At first, she barely noticed the sight, as homeless people or those struggling to get by had become a sad but common reality. Yet this one was different. The figure was small, too small, a child. Every evening, just before closing, she would see the child creeping toward the back alley, rummaging through the discarded produce and expired bread she threw away. Jessica didn't know why it bothered her so much. Maybe it was because the child was alone, or perhaps it was because she remembered distantly what it was like to go to bed hungry. But hunger alone didn't justify stealing, and she wasn't running a charity. If she started giving away food to every hard luck case, she'd be out of business within a year. Then one evening, as she was stocking shelves, she saw a small shadow slip through the door. The girl, because it was a girl, she realized was no older than 7 or 8. Her hair was short and uneven, as if someone had cut it in haste, and she wore an oversized jacket patched and faded, with shoes so worn out that they barely held together. Jessica narrowed her eyes and pretended not to watch as the girl moved down the aisles. The child was quick, darting glances at the counter to see if she was being watched, and then, just as swiftly, her small hand reached out, grabbed a loaf of bread from the lower shelf, and tucked it into her jacket. Jessica sat down the can she was holding and walked forward. "Hey," she called out in a firm voice, causing the girl to freeze. Jessica approached, her hands resting on her hips, empty pockets visible as the girl looked around, as if searching for an escape. Her thin fingers clutched to the edge of her jacket. She didn't speak. Her eyes were wide, dark, and full of something that Jessica couldn't quite place. Fear, defiance, or perhaps a mix of both. Jessica extended a hand, saying, "Come on, I saw you take it for a moment." The girl didn't move. Then, slowly, she pulled the loaf of bread from her jacket and held it out, her fingers trembling slightly. Jessica took it and sighed. "You can't just walk in here and steal, kid. You hungry?" The girl still didn't speak. She looked down at the floor, her small frame tense. "You got parents?" Jessica asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. The girl hesitated, then turned on her heel and ran out the door. Jessica watched as she disappeared down the street, exhaling slowly and pressing the loaf of bread against her hip. She wasn't sure what she had expected: gratitude, an apology, maybe just a word to explain why a child was stealing food instead of being home safe and warm. But life, as she had learned long ago, didn't work that way. Still, as she went back to restocking the shelves, she found that she couldn't shake the image of the girl's frightened eyes. The next evening, she kept watch as the girl came again. This time, she didn't enter the store. Instead, she went straight to the back alley, waiting for the moment when no one was looking before slipping toward the dumpsters. Jessica moved quietly to the back door, cracking it open just enough to see the girl's small hands digging through the discarded food, pulling out an old bag of rolls that had gone stale. She tucked them into her jacket, then hesitated and looked around cautiously. When she was sure no one was watching, the girl darted away, disappearing into the night. Jessica's grip tightened on the doorknob as she recalled having seen plenty of thieves over the years, teenagers stealing beer, grown men stuffing candy bars into their coats. But this was different. A child shouldn't have to dig through garbage to eat, and the thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The next day, she found herself watching the front door again. She wasn't sure why. Maybe part of her expected the girl to come back inside to try stealing again, or perhaps she wanted to confront her properly this time to ask what the hell was going on. Instead, the girl never entered the store. She went straight to the dumpsters, just like the night before, and, just like before, she took what she could and disappeared. Jessica exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. This was getting under her skin in a way she didn't like. She wasn't a social worker, she wasn't responsible for other people's problems, but something about that little girl wouldn't leave her alone. By the third night, Jessica made a decision. If the girl wasn't going to talk, then Jessica would just have to follow her and find out the truth herself. Jessica Thompson had never considered herself a particularly curious person. She had lived in the same neighborhood for years, ran the same small grocery store, and followed the same daily routine without much deviation. She didn't ask questions, she didn't need answers, and she certainly didn't meddle in things that weren't her business. But for the third evening in a row, she found herself standing behind the store's back door, watching the little girl disappear down the alley, clutching a stale loaf of bread to her chest. Something inside her tightened as she stepped back into the store to lock up for the night. The girl was too small, too thin, and there was something in the way she moved, quick, cautious, like a stray animal always expecting a kick, that left Jessica feeling uneasy. She knew that look. She had seen it before, years ago in the mirror when she was a child. That night, she lay awake in bed longer than usual. Sleep didn't come easy as she told herself it wasn't her problem, that she wasn't a savior, and certainly wasn't about to take on the responsibility of someone else's child. Yet, the image of those tiny hands digging through garbage, the way the girl had clutched that loaf of bread as if it were a treasure, refused to leave her mind. By morning, Jessica had made a decision, though she wasn't sure she liked it. If the girl wasn't going to talk, then Jessica would have to follow her. She needed to see where the girl went, needed to know if she had a home, if there was someone looking after her. The evening came too slowly as she worked through the day in a fog, barely listening to her regular customers. By the time she closed up the store, she felt a strange sense of anticipation curling in her stomach. She didn't have to wait long. Right on schedule, just as the street lights flickered on, the girl appeared at the far end of the alley. Moving cautiously, her small frame was barely visible in the dim glow of the overhead bulbs. Jessica stayed behind the door, watching as the girl approached the dumpster, searching for anything remotely edible. When the girl turned to leave, Jessica slipped out of the store, careful to stay far enough behind so as not to be noticed. The girl walked quickly, her arms wrapped around the food she had gathered, her head ducked low, as if she were afraid to be seen. They wound through the streets past closed storefronts and dimly lit apartment buildings. Jessica felt an odd pang as she realized just how well the girl navigated the city, slipping through shadows and avoiding the main roads as if she had done this 100 times before. No child should know how to move like that. After several blocks, the girl turned sharply into a narrow alley. Jessica hesitated for a moment before following. The buildings here were older, some boarded up, their windows covered in graffiti. The alley led to a small abandoned house with peeling paint and a front door barely hanging on its hinges. Jessica hung back, watching as the girl slipped inside with no hesitation and without knocking. It was clear this wasn't just a stop along the way. This was home, at least for a moment. Jessica considered turning around and leaving. She had followed her and gotten her answer. The girl had somewhere to go. She wasn't completely alone. Maybe that was enough. But then she heard it. A small, muffled but unmistakable child's voice. Jessica moved closer, peering through a broken window. Inside, the girl knelt on the floor beside a thin, frail-looking boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. He sat on a pile of blank, shivering slightly as the girl pulled the bread from her jacket and handed it to him. His hands were too small, too weak, but he took the bread with a grateful expression, biting into it hungrily. Jessica's chest tightened as she realized the girl had a brother. She watched as the girl sat down beside him, stroking his hair as he ate. There was no mother, no father, just the two of them, alone in a house that looked as if it could collapse at any moment. In the corner, half hidden under a blanket, lay a small, motionless figure. At first, Jessica thought it was another child. Then she saw the thin ribs rising and falling with each breath. It was a dog, barely more than skin and bones, its fur patchy and dull. The girl reached over, breaking off a small piece of bread and offering it to the animal with gentle, careful movements. Jessica felt something crack inside her. For days, she had assumed the worst about this girl, convinced she was just another street kid with sticky fingers. But this wasn't a troublemaker. This was a child trying desperately to keep her little brother alive, a child who had even taken an stray animal because, even in her own desperation, she had enough kindness to share what little she had. Jessica stepped back from the window, her breath unsteady. She knew she should leave, should pretend she had never seen any of this, but she couldn't. For the first time in years, something inside her told her that she couldn't just walk away. Jessica Thompson sat at her kitchen table, staring at the cup of tea she had barely touched. The steam had long since disappeared, leaving the liquid dark and uninviting, while the events of the previous night played on a relentless loop in her mind, unforgiving and vivid. She had followed a little girl, expecting to confirm her suspicions that she was just another street kid up to no good, only to find a child desperately trying to keep her younger brother alive. She had stood outside that crumbling house, watching as Emily shared stolen bread with her brother, comforting him in a way no child should have to, while the poor, frail dog curled up beside them. Yet another mouth to feed, another responsibility that should never have been placed on such small shoulders. Jessica had walked away, but she had not been able to shake the image from her mind. Her instincts told her to stay out of it. After all, the world was full of suffering, and trying to fix everything was impossible. But she couldn't stop thinking about the way Emily had held her brother close and given away food she clearly needed just so he wouldn't go to bed hungry. As the sun rose outside, painting the sky in streaks of pink and orange, the city began to wake up. Yet Jessica felt frozen in place, paralyzed by the weight of what she had seen. She thought about her store, about how many times she had judged people for stealing and assumed the worst, calling children like Emily thieves without ever stopping to wonder why they stole in the first place. Pushing the cold cup of tea away and rubbing her temples, she knew she needed to do something. But what? Giving them food wasn't enough. Even if she left bags of groceries at their doorstep, it wouldn't solve anything in the long run. They needed stability, safety, and someone who would fight for them. And the terrifying truth was that she didn't know if she was strong enough to be that person. When she opened the store later that morning, she felt disconnected from her routine. The usual customers came and went, their voices blending into a dull hum as she handed out change, bagged groceries, and answered questions, all while her mind was elsewhere. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emily's thin face with big, wary eyes, and she saw Michael's tiny hands clutching a piece of bread as if it were the most precious thing in the world. It wasn't until early afternoon that Jessica saw someone she truly didn't want to see, Rebecca. Rebecca had lived in the neighborhood for nearly as long as Jessica had, and in that time, she had managed to establish herself as the unofficial voice of discontent, with an opinion about everything and everyone. Most of her opinions were laced with bitterness and prejudice. Rebecca was the type of woman who saw a homeless person and assumed they were lazy, who looked at struggling families and decided they weren't trying hard enough. She strolled into the store as if she owned the place, her sharp blue eyes scanning the aisles, dressed in her usual pastel cardigan with an expensive handbag hanging from one arm. Although she had always been well off, though no one quite knew where her money came from, Jessica forced herself to remain neutral as she greeted her. "Rebecca," she said, but Rebecca barely acknowledged her, moving toward the shelves with a calculating air. Jessica knew Rebecca wasn't there just to shop. Sure enough, after a few moments, Rebecca turned back to Jessica, her lips pressed into a thin line, and said, "You've been spending a lot of time near that old house on Hawthorne Street." Her voice was casual in a way that wasn't casual at all, and Jessica's stomach tightened. She should have known someone would notice. Rebecca saw everything that happened in the neighborhood and never let anything go unquestioned. Jessica maintained a neutral expression and replied, "I don't know what you're talking about." Rebecca gave a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, please. I saw you lurking around there the other night. I know what you're doing." Jessica folded her arms, leaning against the counter, and asked, "And what exactly do you think I'm doing?" Rebecca pursed her lips and tilted her head slightly, adding in a tone that made Jessica's skin crawl, "Those kids, they trouble." Jessica replied carefully, "They're just children." Rebecca corrected her sharply, "They trouble, and they don't belong here. You think I don't know what kind of people they are? First, they steal food. Then they start breaking into houses. Next thing you know, they're running with gangs. It's always the same story." Jessica felt anger rise in her chest. Just yesterday, she might have agreed, might have nodded along, convincing herself that it wasn't her business and that some people just ended up where they belonged. But she had seen Emily give away food she desperately needed, and she had seen the way Emily shielded her brother from the world. Jessica had been wrong, and she refused to stand there and listen to Rebecca spew her poison. "They're starving," Jessica said, her voice tight. "A little girl is trying to keep her baby brother alive, and all you can think about is how inconvenient that is for you." Rebecca scoffed, shaking her head. "You think giving them food is going to change anything? You think they won't just keep taking from people, never stop taking?" Jessica's hand curled into a fist at her side. "People like that," Rebecca shrugged dismissively, as Jessica stared at her, her heart pounding. She had known Rebecca for years, had tolerated her ignorance and sharp words as they rolled off her shoulders. But not this time. "This isn't your business," Jessica said in a colder tone than she expected. Rebecca's eyes flashed with amusement, as if she had already won. "Oh, but it is. I don't want those kids ruining our neighborhood. And if you keep helping them, you'll regret it." With that, Rebecca turned on her heel and walked out of the store, leaving Jessica standing there with her pulse thundering in her ears. Although Jessica wanted to believe Rebecca was bluffing, deep down she knew better. Rebecca didn't make threats she didn't intend to follow through on, and if she had set her sights on Emily and Michael, then they were in danger. Jessica had spent her whole life believing she could stay neutral, keep to herself, and let the world move on without interfering. But standing there, feeling the weight of Rebecca's words pressing down on her, she realized something. She had already chosen a side, and now there was no turning back. Outside, the air was thick with the weight of an oncoming storm. The clouds loomed low, heavy and dark, swallowing what little light remained as the sun dipped below the horizon. Jessica stood at the entrance of her store, the keys clenched tightly in her hand, her thoughts still tangled in the conversation with Rebecca. She had never liked the woman, yet she had never been one to make enemies. Rebecca was the kind of person who held grudges like a vice, and once she decided someone was in her way, she didn't stop until she had pushed them out. Jessica had seen it before. Neighbors who disagreed with her business, people she deemed undesirable. Rebecca always found a way to make their lives hell. Now, Jessica had painted a target on her own back. She locked the door and turned toward her car, but hesitated. The house on Hawthorne Street wasn't far, and Emily and Michael were still there, still vulnerable. Rebecca knew about them now, and Jessica didn't trust for a second that Rebecca would simply let it go. Her pulse quickened as she climbed into her car. The decision had already been made the moment she had spoken against Rebecca. She had spent too much time second-guessing herself, questioning whether she should get involved, and now that time was over. The streets were quiet as she drove, the occasional flicker of neon signs from run-down convenience stores casting eerie reflections on the wet pavement. Although Jessica knew these roads well, tonight they felt unfamiliar, different, as if something unseen lurked in the shadows, waiting. When she reached the alley near the abandoned house, she killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the silence. The windows of the house were dark, yet she knew someone was inside. Stepping out with light footsteps, she approached the door and knocked softly just once. When nothing happened, she tried again, a long pause, then the sound of shuffling inside. The door cracked open just enough for a pair of wary eyes to appear. "Emily," came the soft word. She didn't say anything else, But Jessica could see the exhaustion on Emily's face, the way her shoulders hunched forward as if bracing for something bad. "It's me," Jessica said gently. "Can I come in?" Emily hesitated, then slowly opened the door wider. The inside was even colder than the night air. Jessica had been here before, but standing in the middle of the room now, she felt the weight of it pressing down on her. There was barely anything inside, just a few old blankets in the corner, an empty can that had once held soup, and Michael curled up against the dog, his small hands buried in its dull fur. Jessica crouched down beside him and asked, "Is he okay?" Emily nodded, though her expression was unreadable. "He's just tired," Jessica exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "Listen, something happened today." Emily's eyes flickered with suspicion. She was always on guard, always expecting the worst. "There's a woman in the neighborhood. Her name is Rebecca. She knows about you and your brother. She's the kind of person who likes to cause trouble." Emily's grip tightened around the edge of her oversized jacket. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The kind that gets people taken away," Jessica admitted, hating the way the words sounded out loud. "She called the police on you once. She might do it again." Emily's entire body stiffened, and for the first time since Jessica had met her, Jessica saw real panic in the girl's eyes. "They can't take Michael," Emily whispered. "I won't let them." Jessica, who had never been particularly emotional, felt her heart tighten as she replied, "I don't want that to happen either. That's why I came. I need you to trust me." Emily looked down, her fingers twitching slightly, as if considering her options. "I don't trust adults," she muttered. Jessica swallowed hard and said, "I get that, but you don't have many choices right now." A long silence stretched between them, until finally Emily exhaled, her shoulders sagging. "What do we do?" she asked. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jessica sat down beside her, her mind racing. She had been so focused on convincing herself that she had a choice in all this that she hadn't actually thought about the next step. Taking them back to her house wasn't an option. Not yet, especially with Rebecca watching and waiting for her to slip up. "We need to be careful," Jessica said. "You can't stay here much longer. It's not safe." Emily glanced toward Michael, who was still curled up beside the dog, his breathing slow and steady. "He's not strong enough to go anywhere," Jessica added, pressing her lips together before continuing. "So we do this in steps. I'll bring food, blankets, whatever you need, but you have to promise me that if I tell you to leave, you'll listen." Emily hesitated, then nodded. Though it wasn't perfect, it wasn't a solution either, but it was something. That night, Jessica left with a plan forming in her mind. She would help them whether they trusted her or not. She would protect them no matter what it took, and she would make sure that Rebecca never got the chance to tear them apart. The storm finally broke as Jessica pulled into her driveway, rain pounding against the windshield. She sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel. She had spent so much of her life looking the other way, pretending things weren't her problem, but this time she couldn't. This time she wouldn't. The morning air was sharp with the lingering chill of last night's rain, and the streets were still damp, the sky overcast and casting everything in a dull gray light. Jessica hadn't slept much. She had spent the night turning over every possible scenario in her head, trying to figure out how to keep Emily and Michael safe without drawing too much attention to them or herself. But Rebecca was a problem she couldn't ignore. The woman had already threatened to interfere, and Jessica knew she wasn't bluffing. Rebecca thrived on conflict, on making life miserable for people she didn't approve of, and she would stop at nothing to see those children removed from the neighborhood. Jessica arrived at her store earlier than usual, her thoughts still tangled in knots. The familiar scent of coffee and fresh bread did little to calm her nerves as she unlocked the door and flipped the sign to open. She needed a plan, something concrete, because sneaking food to Emily and Michael was only a temporary solution. They couldn't live in that house forever. The morning passed in a blur of transactions and half-hearted conversations with customers. Even before she saw Rebecca, Jessica could feel her presence, for that was how it always was with people like her. They carried an energy, a forcefulness, that wormed its way into the air before they even spoke. Rebecca walked in with an air of smug confidence, her eyes scanning the store before landing on Jessica. "I warned you," Rebecca said, setting her purse down on the counter. Jessica's stomach tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied. Rebecca smirked, tapping a manicured finger against the counter, and said, "Don't play dumb. Jessica, I saw you lurking around there the other night. I know what you're doing." Jessica folded her arms, leaning against the counter, and asked, "And what exactly do you think I'm doing?" Rebecca pursed her lips and tilted her head slightly, adding in a tone that made Jessica's skin crawl, "Those kids, they trouble." Jessica said carefully, "They're just children." Rebecca corrected her sharply. "They trouble, and they don't belong here. You think I don't know what kind of people they are? First, they steal food. Then they start breaking into houses. Next thing you know, they're running with gangs. It's always the same story." Jessica felt anger rise in her chest. Just yesterday, she might have agreed, might have nodded along, convincing herself that it wasn't her business and that some people just ended up where they belonged. But she had seen Emily give away food she desperately needed, and she had seen the way Emily shielded her brother from the world. Jessica had been wrong, and she refused to stand there and listen to Rebecca spew her poison. "They're starving," Jessica said, her voice tight. "A little girl is trying to keep her baby brother alive, and all you can think about is how inconvenient that is for you." Rebecca scoffed, shaking her head. "You think giving them food is going to change anything? You think they won't just keep taking from people, never stop taking?" Jessica's hand curled into a fist at her side. "People like that," Rebecca shrugged dismissively, and Jessica stared at her, her heart pounding. She had known Rebecca for years, had tolerated her ignorance and sharp words as they rolled off her shoulders, but not this time. "This isn't your business," Jessica said in a colder tone than she expected. Rebecca's eyes flashed with amusement, as if she had already won. "Oh, but it is. I don't want those kids ruining our neighborhood. And if you keep helping them, you'll regret it." With that, Rebecca turned on her heel and walked out, her heels clicking against the tile floor. Jessica stood frozen, her thoughts racing. She had to get to Emily and Michael before Child Protective Services did. Without thinking, she grabbed her keys and ran for the door, flipping the closed sign as she left. The drive to the house on Hawthorne Street felt endless. Every red light, every slow-moving car was an unbearable delay. By the time she reached the alley, her heart was hammering against her ribs. She barely had time to get out of the car before she saw them. Two white vans with uniformed workers standing by the door. Her breath caught in her throat. They were already there. She ran. Emily was standing on the porch, her small hands curled into fists at her sides, her whole body rigid with fear, while Michael clung to the fabric of her jacket, his eyes wide with panic. The dog, Timmy, was barking weakly, its frail frame barely able to stand. Jessica pushed through the gathering crowd, her voice sharp and urgent. "Wait, wait." A man in a navy jacket turned to her, clipboard in hand, his expression polite but firm. "Ma'am, please step back. This is a Child Protective Services investigation." Jessica ignored him, her eyes locked on Emily. "It's okay," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm here." Emily's eyes were wild with desperation. "Don't let them take us." One of the workers moved toward her, reaching for her arm. Emily jerked back violently, shouting, "Don't touch me." Michael whimpered, gripping her tighter. Jessica's chest ached as she turned back to the man with the clipboard and pleaded, "Please, they have nowhere else to go." The man gave her a measured look and asked, "Are you their legal guardian?" "No," she admitted, "but then you need to step aside." Her heart pounded as she lowered her voice. "Listen, you don't understand. If you take them now, you'll separate them. You'll throw them into the system, and they'll never see each other again." The man's expression remained unreadable as he replied, "That's not up to you." Emily's breathing was ragged, her hands shaking as she clutched Michael closer. "I won't go," she said through gritted teeth. One of the women moved forward and said, "Sweetheart, we're here to help." Emily lashed out, shoving the woman away. "You're lying." The woman stumbled back, startled, and the man said sharply, "That's enough." Two of the workers moved in quicker this time. Emily fought, She kicked and screamed, thrashing wildly as they grabbed her arms, while Michael sobbed, his tiny hands reaching for her. Jessica felt something inside her snap. "Stop!" She surged forward, grabbing Emily's wrist before they could pull her away. "I'll take them," she declared. "I'll take both of them." The man hesitated. "It's not that simple." "I don't care," she insisted. "I'll foster them, whatever it takes." The workers exchanged glances. One of the women sighed and asked, "Do you even know what you're asking for?" "Yes," Jessica said steadily, "I do." A heavy silence hung between them until finally the man exhaled and said, "You'll have to go through the system, background checks, home inspections, and even then there's no guarantee." "I don't care," Jessica repeated. "Just don't separate them." The man nodded slowly. "We'll need to process everything first. For now, the children will have to come with us." Jessica's stomach twisted as Emily still trembled, her eyes darting between Jessica and the workers. "Will you come back?" Emily asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Jessica knelt in front of her and solemnly swore, "I swear, I'll get you both back." It wasn't enough, perhaps, but it was all she could give. She watched as they were led into the van, Michael sobbing into his sister's jacket, and then the van shut their doors and pulled away. Jessica stood there alone, her hands shaking at her sides. She had made a promise, and now she had to find a way to keep it. The store felt emptier than usual. The soft hum of the refrigerators and the rhythmic clicking of the ceiling fan above were the only sounds keeping Jessica company as she sat behind the counter, staring at the register without really seeing it. The day had passed in a blur, customers coming and going, voices mingling into an indistinct background noise. She had barely spoken more than a few words to anyone, her mind consumed by the image of Emily and Michael being taken away. The silence of her home the previous night had been even worse. The moment she had stepped through the door, she had felt the weight of their absence like a stone pressing against her chest. The house had felt colder, emptier, too quiet. Even Timmy's small, weak barks were missing. She had barely slept, pacing the length of her kitchen and checking her phone every few minutes, half hoping for a message or a call. Anything, but nothing came. When she had promised Emily that she would bring them back, she had meant it, though she hadn't realized just how difficult that promise would be to keep. By mid-morning, Jessica made another decision. She wasn't going to sit around and wait. Ignoring the puzzled looks from her regulars, she locked up the store early and got into her car. The drive to the Child Protective Services office felt longer than it should have been. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as she approached a building of unremarkable gray walls, large glass doors, and a small reception area with stiff plastic chairs and outdated magazines stacked on a low table. The woman behind the counter barely looked up when Jessica approached and said, "I need to speak to someone about 2 children who were taken into custody yesterday." Keeping her voice steady despite the tightness in her throat, Jessica filled out the clipboard form as directed. When she handed it back, the receptionist glanced at it before disappearing behind a door. Minutes stretched into an hour as Jessica sat in one of the plastic chairs, her knee bouncing impatiently every time the door opened. She sat up straighter each time, only to see someone else, a tired-looking woman with a toddler on her hip, a man arguing with a caseworker, a teenage girl sitting with her arms crossed and staring at the floor. Finally, her name was called. A tall man with neatly combed hair and a weary expression led her into a small office. His nameplate read Mr. Davis, senior caseworker. He gestured for her to sit, then settled into his own chair, adjusting the papers on his desk. "You're here about Emily and Michael Carter?" he said, glancing up at her. "Yes," Jessica replied quickly. "I want to take them in." Mr. Davis sighed, leaning back slightly. "Miss Thompson, I understand your concern, but that's not how this works. The children are now in state custody. There are procedures in place." "I don't care about procedures," Jessica said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Those kids have no one else. I've been helping them for weeks. They trust me." Mr. Davis rubbed a hand over his face. "Trust isn't enough. Do you have any legal claim to them? Are you a relative, a previously established guardian?" "No," she admitted, "but then the answer is no," Mr. Davis said, "at least for now. The system isn't perfect, Miss Thompson, but we have to follow protocol." They'll be placed in temporary care while we evaluate their situation. Temporary care, Jessica repeated, knowing exactly what that meant. Foster homes, separation. They can't be separated. They only have each other, she said, and Mr. Davis gave her a sympathetic look. We try to keep siblings together when possible, but there's no guarantee. Jessica clenched her jaw. Then what do I have to do? Mr. Davis studied her for a long moment, as if trying to gauge just how serious she was. Finally, he pulled out a thick stack of papers from his drawer and slid them across the desk. You can apply for emergency foster placement, he said. It's a long process, background checks, home inspections, psychological evaluations, and even then, it's up to the court whether or not you qualify. Jessica took the papers, her fingers tightening around them. How long does it take? She asked. Mr. Davis admitted, sometimes months, sometimes longer. Jessica exhaled slowly. I don't have months. Emily and Michael don't have months. After a brief hesitation, Mr. Davis continued. If you can prove an existing relationship with the children, if you can convince a judge that they would be safest with you, you might be able to expedite the process. Hope flickered in Jessica's chest as she asked, what do I have to do? Mr. Davis handed her another form, a petition for temporary custody. It'll go before a judge, he explained, if you can provide evidence, witnesses, documentation. Anything that shows you've been actively involved in their care, it might improve your chances. Without wasting another second, Jessica took the forms and spent the next few hours filling them out in her car. Every question felt like a test, every answer a weight pressing down on her. She had never thought about becoming a parent. She had spent years keeping her life simple, avoiding attachments. Now, sitting in a parking lot and applying to become a foster mother to 2 children she had met only weeks ago, she didn't hesitate. She gathered everything she could, receipts from the food she had bought them, notes from customers who had seen her helping them, even security footage from her store showing Emily sneaking in night after night, proof that she had been there, watching over them. She submitted the paperwork before the office closed, and then waited. Days passed, each one slower than the last. Every morning she called the office to check on their status, only to receive the same answer. Processing, reviewing, pending. She couldn't see them. She wasn't allowed to know where they had been placed. It was agonizing. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, she got the call. Her petition had been approved for a hearing. She had one chance to prove to a judge that she could give him a home, and she had never been more terrified in her life. But she had made a promise, and she intended to keep it. The morning of the hearing was colder than it should have been for late spring. Jessica woke before dawn, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. She had barely slept. Her thoughts were consumed by what lay ahead and by the weight of what she was about to do. She had never stepped foot inside a courtroom before, and the very idea of standing before a judge pleading for the right to take in 2 children she had no legal claim to filled her with nervous energy that made it impossible to sit still. She had rehearsed every possible question they might ask her, every response in her head, yet she knew there was no guarantee. The drive to the courthouse felt shorter than it should have been. The city was just beginning to wake as she pulled into the parking lot, the sky streaked with hints of pink and orange. She sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and forcing herself to take deep, steady breaths. This was it. Inside the courthouse, the environment was sterile and unwelcoming, the air thick with the scent of old paper and disinfectant. The area was filled with people, lawyers in crisp suits, families sitting in intense silence, and social workers flipping through thick case files. Jessica felt out of place among them, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. She spotted Mr. Davis near the courtroom entrance, speaking in hushed tones with another caseworker. When he saw her, he gave a small nod, though his expression remained unreadable. "Miss Thompson," he greeted in a neutral tone. "How are they? Have you seen them?" He hesitated for just a moment. "Emily has been difficult," he added. "She refuses to talk to her foster parents. Michael has been quieter than usual." Jessica's stomach twisted. She had expected as much, but hearing it out loud made it even worse. "They're scared," she murmured more to herself than to him. Mr. Davis nodded, explaining, "That's why this hearing is happening so quickly. The judge wants to determine if they're better off staying in the system or being placed with you temporarily." The word temporarily lingered between them, a reminder that even if she won today, there would still be battles ahead. Before Jessica could respond, the courtroom doors opened and a familiar voice called her name. Her heart pounded as she stepped into a room smaller than she had imagined. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and the judge's bench was raised slightly above the rest of the room. An older woman with sharp eyes and gray hair sat at the front, flipping through the case file with practiced efficiency. Emily and Michael were already seated. Jessica barely held back a gasp when she saw them. Emily sat stiffly in her chair, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes dark with anger, and her lips pressed into a firm line. Michael sat beside her, his hands clenched together in his lap. Looking smaller than Jessica remembered, his little shoulders drawn inward as if trying to make himself invisible. When Emily's eyes met Jessica's, something flickered across her face: surprise, confusion, and something else that Jessica couldn't quite place. Forcing herself to focus, she listened as the judge cleared her throat and began, "We're here today to determine the temporary placement of Emily and Michael Carter." Glancing up from a file, the judge addressed Jessica. "Miss Thompson, I see that you've petitioned for emergency foster status. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jessica replied, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. The judge then turned her gaze to Mr. Davis and asked, "Has Miss Thompson been vetted? Does her background check come back clean?" "Yes," he confirmed. "She has no prior offenses, no history of complaints, and she's been financially stable for the past 15 years. She owns her home and runs her business without any dependents." The judge nodded in consideration. "Miss Thompson, can you tell me why you wish to take responsibility for these children?" Jessica swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Because they don't belong in the system," she said passionately. "They belong together, and they need someone who's willing to fight for them." The judge's eyes softened just slightly, though her expression remained unreadable. "Emily," she said, turning to the girl, "do you have anything you'd like to say?" Emily didn't move at first, then slowly lifted her chin and said in a quiet but firm voice, "I don't want to go back to that house." "And why is that?" the judge asked. Emily hesitated, glancing toward Michael, and replied, "Because we won't stop. We have to stay together, because no one ever tells the truth. They say they'll help, but they just put us somewhere else with strangers, and we always have to start over. I'm tired of starting over." Jessica's chest ached, and the judge nodded in understanding. "Do you want to stay with Miss Thompson?" she asked Emily. Emily's gaze flickered toward Jessica. After a long, thoughtful pause, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The judge then looked at Michael and asked, "What about you, young man?" Michael didn't speak. He simply reached for Emily's hand, gripping it tightly. That was answer enough. The judge exhaled slowly, tapping her pen against the desk, and said, "Very well. Given the circumstances, I'm granting temporary guardianship to Miss Thompson effective immediately. A full evaluation will be required in 60 days, at which point we will determine if permanent placement is appropriate." Jessica barely heard the rest. Her whole body felt light and unsteady as relief flooded through her. She had done it. She had kept her promise. Although Emily still looked guarded and unsure, when the bail opened the door, she reached for Michael's hand and stood as they stepped out into the hallway. Jessica finally let out the breath she had been holding. Emily looked at her carefully and said in a quiet voice, "You really did it." Jessica simply nodded and replied, "I told you I would." Emily's lips pressed together, and then, after a long moment, she exhaled softly. "Okay, we'll see." Jessica knew that trust wouldn't come easily, but she also knew that this was the first step, and she wasn't going anywhere. The drive home was quiet. Jessica had expected Emily to be tense, but she hadn't anticipated the complete silence that had settled over the car. Michael sat in the back seat, his small hands gripping the seat belt tightly and his eyes fixed on the window, while Emily sat beside him, staring straight ahead with her jaw clenched. Jessica didn't push them to talk, understanding that it was overwhelming. Emily had spent her whole life learning not to trust adults, and one courtroom hearing wasn't going to change that. It would take time, and it would take patience, and Jessica was prepared for both. When they finally arrived at her house, it felt different. The air was heavier, and the silence stretched between them like an invisible barrier. Michael hesitated in the doorway, his small frame rigid with uncertainty, and Jessica said softly, "You can come in." Michael looked up at Emily, as if waiting for permission. Emily gave him a small nod, and only then did he take a cautious step forward, his eyes darting around the room. Jessica had spent the last few days preparing for this moment. She had set up 2 bedrooms, one for each of them, even though she suspected Emily might insist on staying close to Michael, and had stocked the kitchen with food, hoping they might like it, even if they didn't yet feel comfortable eating there. "I can show you your rooms," she offered gently. Emily folded her arms and replied, "We don't need separate rooms." Jessica hesitated briefly, then said, "Okay, but they're there if you change your mind." Emily didn't respond, but Michael tugged at her sleeve, asking, "Can I see?" With a soft sigh from Emily, Jessica led them down the hall, pushing open the first door. It was a small, simple, but warm room. The bed had clean sheets, and a few books were neatly stacked on the nightstand, with space left for them to put their own things, even though she knew they had almost nothing to bring. Michael walked in slowly, his fingers brushing against the edge of the bed as if testing whether it was real. His lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. Emily lingered in the doorway while Jessica watched her carefully and said, "It's just a room. Nothing fancy, but it's yours." Emily's fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack for the moment, and Jessica exhaled softly, agreeing that for now it would have to do. That night, Jessica lay awake for hours. The house was too quiet in a cautious, careful way. Sometime after midnight, she heard soft footsteps in the hall. She didn't get up or move, but listened as Emily led Michael from his room to the couch in the living room. She heard the soft rustle of blankets and the way the cushions shifted under their small bodies. They weren't ready to settle in yet, but that was okay. She could wait. Over the next few weeks, adjustment was difficult for all of them. Emily remained distant, her guard always up. She spoke in clipped sentences, giving no more than necessary, and ate quickly, as if afraid the food might disappear if she didn't finish fast enough. Michael was quieter but easier to reach. He followed Emily's lead, softening quicker as his curiosity pushed past his fear. The hardest part for Jessica was learning to let them set the pace. She wanted to help, but knew that forcing them into anything would only make things worse, so she allowed them to come to her in their own time. It began with small gestures. One night, Michael lingered in the kitchen while she cooked, watching as she chopped vegetables. She handed him a piece of carrot without a word, and he took it, chewing thoughtfully. Another night, Emily sat on the porch while Jessica worked in the garden. She didn't say anything, but she didn't leave either. Though it wasn't much, it was something. Then one morning, everything shifted. Jessica was making breakfast when Michael padded into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He climbed onto one of the stools and watched as she flipped pancakes onto a plate. Hesitantly, he said quietly, "Can I have one?" It was such a small request, so simple, yet it was the first time he had ever asked for something. Jessica slid a plate in front of him, and of course, Michael picked up his fork, his expression thoughtful as he said, "You make good pancakes." Jessica smiled and replied, "Thanks." At that moment, Emily appeared in the doorway, watching the two of them. Jessica met her gaze without saying a word. Emily sighed and sat down beside Michael, pulling her knees up to her chest. Though she hadn't asked for a pancake, she didn't refuse when Jessica put one in front of her either. It was slow progress, but progress nonetheless. As the weeks turned into months, Jessica took them shopping for clothes that actually fit, signed Michael up for school, and sat through endless meetings with caseworkers. She fought through mountains of paperwork, met with therapists, attended court dates, and spent hours convincing people that she was the right person to care for them. It was exhausting, but it was worth it. Nearly a year later, The final hearing for adoption came. Jessica had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with possibilities as the judge would have the final say. She had done everything she could, but in the end, it wasn't entirely up to her. The courtroom felt smaller this time, the air thick with tension. Emily sat stiffly beside her, while Michael fidgeted in his seat. Jessica kept her hands folded in her lap, forcing herself to stay calm as the judge glanced at the paperwork before looking up. Emily, Michael, you've been with Miss Thompson for nearly a year now. Do you feel safe in her home? Emily sat up straighter and answered, yes. The judge nodded. Do you want to stay with her? Emily hesitated for a moment. Jessica's heart stopped. Then finally Emily turned to look at her and said quietly, I don't want to start over again. Jessica's throat tightened, and the judge smiled slightly. I'll take that as a yes. The ruling came quickly after that. The adoption was finalized, the papers were signed, and just like that, they were officially a family. That night, when they got home, Michael ran through the house laughing as he chased Timmy around the living room. Jessica watched them, feeling something deep in her chest loosen for the first time in months. Emily stood beside her, arms crossed, and said, This doesn't change anything. Jessica glanced at her and replied, No. Emily shifted, looking uncertain. We're still not used to this. Jessica nodded gently. That's okay, we've got time. After a long moment of silence, Emily sighed and muttered, Thanks. Jessica didn't say anything further. She simply reached out and gently squeezed Emily's shoulder. Emily didn't pull away. This was a start, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Check out more videos for additional incredible stories. And if this video touched you, share it with your friends.